Good afternoon. I'd like to call the Land Use Advisory Committee meeting to order on November 20th, 2025. Today we do have a lot of things on our agenda, so I will just be doing the Dakota Land, Water, and People Acknowledgement. I won't be reading the whole thing. Everyone's had a chance to review the agenda. All right, that looks good. Looking for an approval of September 18th meeting minutes.
I'll move to approve. Second.
Second, all right, any discussion? None? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it. And up first, we're gonna have the 2025-304 2050 Planning Assistance Grant Program and Small Communities Planning Program Funding Award Recommendations. And I'll give it over to you, Angela.
Thank you, Chair. Afternoon, Chair and committee members, good to see you again. I'm Angela Torres, the Senior Manager of Local Planning Assistance. And as soon as our presentation pops up, I'll go ahead and start our presentation. Oh, that looks promising. There we go. Thank you for our technical staff. So this is table 1 from your staff report. For the Planning Assistance Grant Program, the committee has reviewed 3 scenarios using 3 community types for award amounts, sewered, unsewered, and either county or consortium. Viewing scenario A as a baseline, the committee reviewed scenarios B and C, indicating a preference for scenario C at the last meeting. Discussion focused on the minor reduction to individual planning grants to support other programs that was far outweighed by the impact of additional assistance for the small communities. Members also emphasized that both scenarios were significant increases from the grants provided in the previous planning cycle, and so this then is the recommended funding scenarios. Table 2 from your staff report is the overall planning assistance fund budget, which has been set at $5.64 million. This includes the planning grants, the 2 incentive grants that are part of that, and the small communities planning program engineering costs. This table shows the distribution of the program funds for different program goals for the preferred scenario. This table also resolves a calculation error that inadvertently left additional dollars in the program budget. The calculation used 5.6 million instead of 5.64 million, so we have additional dollars. And since the programmatic goal is to expend all of the budget dollars, and given the discussion with you all previously, we would recommend those additional funds get added to the small communities planning program engineering costs. This would increase each of the 29 eligible communities allocation by $2,500 and expend all but $1,500 of the program budget. Table 3 from your staff report identifies the range of costs by community type and budget scenario for all 29 eligible communities. This identifies the possible budget allocation for each local government based on what type of services are provided. The table shows how many communities fall into each type and the estimated cost to accomplish the water planning for those communities. Even though the communities are small, there are different engineering needs. LUAC, after indicating preference for scenario C, had a general consensus around providing a not to exceed engineering allocation for program participants. This allows for an estimated budgetary allocation toward engineering costs based on participants' need and expected planning effort, considering their community type for wastewater, whether that's sewered or unsewered, and water supply, which is private or public planning. The not to exceed allocation approach provides the option for local governments to choose which engineering services, whether that's wastewater, water supply, or surface water management, that they wish to prioritize out of that allocation. Any additional engineering costs would be required to be the responsibility of the local government. And remember that the budget allocation isn't dollars distributed to the city, but allowed for the engineering consulting firms that the council will contract with to be used for that particular individual community's engineering costs. The business item includes a recommendation for an additional $14,000 maximum for each eligible community to increase their base award amounts, with $10,000 toward incentivizing the advancement of regional goals and $4,000 towards incentivizing early plan completion. These amounts reflect the effort needed to meet the goals of each incentive grant while providing a higher level of assistance where it will likely be needed most. Because of the variety of approaches and multiple regional goals, the regional goal incentive is intended to be community-driven and locally specific. I wanted to provide some examples of 2040 plans with approaches that went above and beyond to prioritize locally important objectives, which were consistent with and supportive of broader regional goals. So I'll talk about those I got just a few examples of those. So Belle Plaine, which is located in Scott County and designated as a rural center community, took a people-centered planning approach. They focused on outcomes for community health, wellness, and resilience of their residents, taking a strong focus on economic equity with a holistic approach, which included the fundamental importance of social and mental health impacts from the built environment. The city of Bloomington, which is located in Hennepin County and designated as an urban edge community, developed their plan from a racial equity perspective, incorporating a new and robust engagement strategies with populations representing their changing demographics. They wanted to become a much more participatory government, working with community organizations to make community connections with different populations. They created a committee of community members which helped drive the comprehensive planning process over a 15-month period. And that's another example of a community-driven approach, above and beyond. City of Fridley, which is in Anoka County and an urban edge community, took an integrated sustainability focus for their comprehensive plan. They embedded sustainability throughout in support of outcomes where climate work becomes the default, really integrating into each of their different chapters in climate focus. The city of Osseo in Hennepin County and an urban edge community took an active lifestyle planning approach, really focusing on the social determinants of health to build iconography, that's those little icons that they used throughout their plan to tag goals and policies which supported their vision. And so that's again, just all four of those are examples of 2040 comprehensive plans that took a new and different approach, very hyper-localized, based on the priorities and needs of those local governments, but examples of what the incentive grant program for advancing regional goals could support. The rationale for the recommendations before you today are grounded in statutory authority for the council to provide both funding to local governments, but also to enter into contracts with local governments to assist with the comprehensive planning process. So the proposed action before you today then is to recommend that the Metropolitan Council set the grant award amounts for the 2050 Planning Assistant Grant Program as follows. The base award amounts for eligible communities are as follows: Seward communities, $40,000, unsewered communities, $25,000, a county or consortium, $110,000. Eligible planning assistance grant program participants may choose to opt in to either or both of the following incentive grants: advancing regional goals at $10,000, early plan completion, $4,000. If an eligible participant opts into an incentive grant program and later either chooses not to or is unable to complete program requirements, they shall forfeit those grant dollars, but there shall be no penalty. And to set the funding amounts for the 2050 Small Communities Planning Program as follows. Each eligible community shall have an identified not to exceed engineering budget allocation based on need and expected planning effort as determined by the type of wastewater and water supply services further described in Table 3 and Attachment 1 of your staff report. Any additional engineering costs would be required to be the responsibility of the local government. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the chair.
Any questions, comments? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question about, I'm interested in 1B3 here about not about forfeiting grant dollars but not being penalized. Have communities been unable to execute some of the projects that they proposed? And usually how long is that time frame?
Chair and committee member, thank you for that question. This is a new program, so it's never been done before. We are kind of allowing for the opportunity for flexibility if the community thinks early on that they would be interested, but then throughout the planning process realize that they may not be able to or either chooses not to kind of follow through with that. That's just fine. They just wouldn't receive the grant dollars. This particular part of the planning grant program has never been offered before.
Okay.
That's why, like, also if you look at some of the examples, the Belle Plaine, the Bloomington, the Fridley, that's why I asked Angela to look at some previous things cities have done with the other comp plans that we've had to see what cities can do that would benefit them to actually go after the regional goals, right? Like the 10,000 or the 4,000. A lot of people tend to think that, you know, when you're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? They think of only a couple of different things, right? But if you look at how Fridley actually framed their plan, right, for barriers, identifying, dismantling projects, snowballs, the climate work that they did, Belle Plaine taking a different approach on how they're doing it, Bloomington, completely different approach, 3 different geographical areas that would benefit from a $10,000 grant if they continue to push forward with their plans for the 2050 plan, right? And that's why we want different ways of thinking, because one way of planning in one area isn't going to be the same for every other geographical area, and we want to make it so it's the most beneficial for all communities to take advantage of the grant dollars and utilize them in different ways that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, if I may, Mr. Chair, I think I'm just more concerned about time frame for being able to use those dollars and prioritizing the use of it rather than just holding on to it and other communities may not be able to access those funds because it's tied up. So I was just looking and also asking more if there has been consideration for more of a time frame instead, about like, you know, a year or 2 years or an extension of a 3rd year, I don't know, to use this. And they're small too. So that's why I would just want us to consider that timing piece.
Chair and committee member, thanks for that second part of your question, which I didn't answer before. So communities are eligible for the total amount. That total amount is reserved for them throughout the planning period. So we will start offering funding availability in Q1 of next year, and then the plan is actually due December 31st of 2028. And so they would receive half of their planning grant base amount upfront. They would receive the rest of that upon completion, which the incentive grants would be part of that wrapping up on the end part to make sure that they met minimum requirements and things. But the dollars, if forfeited, go back into the planning assistance grant fund. And while staff could bring back to the council to consider if they wanted to expend those dollars still within this planning period, usually those dollars are reserved in the fund to help generate the next round of dollars over the next 10 years.
So once, all they need to do is put what they want to do with the grant into their comp plan, as long as it's by December 31st, 2028, doesn't mean that they actually have to follow through with it by December 31st, 2028?
Chair and committee members, largely what we would see is a work plan that's included as part of their grant contract, and they would have to meet the identified requirements within their work plan. That could be a robust engagement program that they've never done before to really reach diverse communities, and identifying that would actually be implemented as part of the development of the plan. And so some of the work that they could use towards implementation. This is for the planning purposes, so we could evaluate something for implementation as part of the local planning assistance program. We do some of that engagement cohort work with communities anyway, but the funds would be in the planning.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, I have a question. I'd like to make a couple of comments. I think I was reading over the material. Did I see a $5.8 million budget for this? Is that right?
Chair and committee member, 5.64
5.6, okay.
for all three programs.
Okay. Well, my feeling, I haven't changed the way I feel on this matter. I don't see why the Met Council should have to pay somebody to fill out forms. If they don't like to do it, then don't do it, but I don't see why the Met Council should have to pay to communities who can afford it but don't want to spend the money on it. It should go to governments or whatever who can't afford it. They should get 100% funding. I think that 5.6 million could be used in better ways. With the need to upgrade these light rail stations, I think would be a better way to spend that money than pay people to do paperwork. So that's my feeling on this matter.
Thank you, and I think the main thing with these grants that we're doing is for those communities that can't afford to take on the full burden of the plans. And we're trying to offset that to allow them to make the changes that they need to fall in line with the 2050 plan. And we're trying to help out the smaller communities. We're not helping the communities that have the money to make the changes and the implementations needed. It's specifically for those communities that have nobody on staff, that have maybe one admin, they don't have planning commission, they don't have people on staff that are helping them go through this process every 10 years. But I totally understand where you're coming from here, 100%.
Mr. Chair, I fully understand where you're coming from too, but that doesn't change the way I feel about this matter. I think with the scarcity of dollars and the need for more money to put in the transportation projects, paying people to fill out forms, I think is a waste of taxpayer money on this matter. So
Thank you.
it could be spent better somewhere else, I think.
Any other comments, questions? Go ahead.
I have a question for you on the actual chart, or the table that lists the communities and dollars in the engineering cost estimates. And my questions are more around just trying to understand the difference between unsewered and municipal sewer in terms of risk to the surrounding area. Like so like I took a look at all these cities or towns actually and said, are they near a water body? And is there more risk of contamination to that water body if they don't have good comprehensive planning for the sewer and the above ground surface management? And so I just want to understand the distinction between MUSA and unsewered, and then what's the risk of sewered and unsewered relative to the surrounding area?
Sure. Chair and committee members, thank you. I'll just walk through a few of those definitions for you. MUSA refers to the Metropolitan Urban Service Area. That's where regional wastewater service is available and part of our long-term sewer service plan. A municipal sewer refers to a community like Belle Plaine, which is a rural center. They have their own wastewater treatment plant, so they still have municipal sewer, but it's not provided by the regional system. They're still a little bit too far to be part of that. Unsewered means that they don't have either a local wastewater treatment plant or are connected to the regional wastewater treatment system. So, and so they use primarily on-site septic systems for their residential, well, commercial. As far as proximity to water bodies, that's individual and specific to every community. And so surface water management is the hardest to kind of estimate because of the really unique characteristics of, you know, both impaired and priority waters and of course water isn't constrained by municipal boundaries. And so that part of it is just harder to provide a cost estimate for, which is why you see just a general cost estimate for all of those, which is also why we were trying to provide where we could a more specific cost estimate based on sewered or unsewered. There's more effort that gets is required from engineers for unsewered versus sewered communities. The sewered communities just take more engineering effort. And so trying to provide a more refined cost estimate where we know that there are going to be higher costs for higher need for the wastewater and then of course the water supply as well.
When I looked through this and I kind of counted and looked at what's all around it because it seems to me the biggest risk if they don't do good comp planning around this is the water body next to them. And there's at least 7 communities that are very near or right on water. And I see the estimates are pretty standard across all of these. And I wondered if there's any interest or opportunity in actually maybe looking at the risk categories and saying, these are the areas we particularly want to be doing better comp planning.
Chair and committee members, we do provide technical assistance individually outside of these programs for local governments. We have a variety of tools and technical staff that are available to answer questions, to help guide them through any challenges, to meet minimum requirements, to make suggestions where, you know, we might encourage other above and beyond actions for their consideration. But we do provide a really robust technical assistance program in addition to this. This is just the financial aspect of it.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, Mr. Chair. So my question's kind of in follow-up, but 2 on the attachment 1. I was just wondering, I mean, everything else seems to be pretty standard between both the MUSA and municipal sewer costs versus unsewered, but then Lilydale has 8,000 for engineering as opposed to 58,000 with all the others. And I'm wondering if you can explain the sort of process or analysis that may have gone into that to have a differentiated cost for Lilydale, for example.
Or is it a typo?
Or is it a typo? Right.
But
Yeah.
there's, it's either 58 or 8, and it's not just Lilydale, right?
But all the muses have.
But all the uses
Oh,
at 58, and so do the municipals, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I'll have to look at this first again, sorry, I can't do it off the top of my head.
no problem.
I did go by our engineers, and they are much smarter than I as it relates to MUSA and wastewater services. I think with Lilydale in particular, that there was an adjustment based on known conditions, because they kind of came in after we were refining the eligibility criteria after the fact, and so we did an adjustment for them. I think it's based on their existing conditions and what we know about the community. Our engineers recommended that, but I will double check the dollars and make sure that that's reflective of what they meant.
Sure.
They have it there. Thank you, Council, committee member.
Any other questions, comments? No? All right, entertain a motion.
I'll make the motion.
All right, second?
Second.
All right, any discussion? No? All those in favor, please signify by aye. All those opposed?
Nay.
Okay, all right, that motion passes. Thank you. Up next, we have 2025-302, the plant monitoring program update recommendations. Mackenzie Young.
Thank you very much. So this is the business item continuing from the information item that I presented on last September. I'll go through the background fairly quickly, hoping that it's still pretty fresh in your mind. The plat monitoring program is a program that's been around since 2001. We use it to track the success of implementing our regional policy in our developing areas. It's made up of 45 communities, primarily in the suburban edge category under Imagine 2050, although there are some suburban and rural center communities involved in it as well. As part of this program, communities report all of their new sewer residential development to us. They let us know the unit mix, information on land consumption, and in exchange for that, if they demonstrate that they are routinely platting above the minimum required by their land use categories, they can get flexibility in some of their future planning based on past performance. So it's a credit program, and that also helps us monitor how the region's developing. When we began looking at the Imagine 2050 regional policy, we realized that we were seeing a bigger and bigger disconnect between the data set we had for communities and what we were observing on the ground and what was in their comprehensive plans and then what was being asked for them in regional policy. So Imagine 2050 committed us to updating this program to ensure that it was relevant and to help address cities' requests for additional flexibility by better aligning the plat monitoring program with what they're actually doing. And the way we're doing that is primarily by looking at the look back period, so how far back in time we're going examining plat monitoring data. Since I last spoke to you, we brought this before the Community Development Committee for their feedback, and I'll talk about what we heard from them later on in this presentation. We also reconvened the plat monitoring focus group to get additional feedback from them. And then I went through and updated all of the numbers to reflect the new 2024 data. When I first talked to you, it was based on the 2023 plat monitoring data. That had the added benefit of letting us look at how much the net average residential density for communities shifted from one year to the next, which gives us a sense of what type of volatility we're gonna have in the different scenarios. So I will be talking about that a little bit too. Just to refresh your memory, we've investigated 5 scenarios for our look back periods. For each of these 5 scenarios, we calculated the number of cities that were gonna increase or decrease their net residential density based, compared to the current system, as well as the number of cities that were gonna be platting under the density policy required by Imagine 2050, the number with less than 10 plats, and then we also calculated out the average and median change in net residential density. And again, as I mentioned, we also looked at then the volatility we were seeing between the 23 and 24 data sets. I'm not gonna go through all the charts we went through last time, I promise, but there are a couple I thought it was worth highlighting. So this is with the updated 2024 data. The top chart is the number of cities that are falling under the density policy required. So for suburban communities, that's 7 units per acre, suburban edge, 3.5, rural centers, 3. I think it's really important to note that under all scenarios, most of our communities are actually already have a plat history above what's being required by regional policy. We see a noted benefit to communities once we drop off the pre-2010 data. We see that jump from 20 to 17. And then we see another jump when we drop off the pre-2019 data. That's not too surprising. The 2040 plans, which align with the 2019 scenario, tended to be a lot higher density, have a lot more mixed use districts. And the 23 and 24 plat monitoring data was far and away the highest reported net residential density we had in the program. So we have, the 2 record-setting years included in that data set and all the old stuff falling back, which is why we see that big bump in 2019 as well. The other characteristic, of course, of the 2019 that's a bit of a drawback is once we drop off all that old data, we see about a third of our communities have less than 10 plats in their data set. So we begin to see the communities that have that really constrained data set tick up in that 2019 scenario, which is relevant when we look at how much of that volatility we saw between the 23 and 24 data. So if we look at this chart for the current plat monitoring system where everything since 2021 is involved, and then also for the 2005 and 2010 scenarios, the biggest change any city saw was a change of going up 1.6 units per acre. A city that didn't have a lot of platting activity had a pretty good multifamily development came in and it really bounced them up. we see when we move to the 2015 and drop more data off, we do see a little bit more of a wobble in how much of a change we saw a city have year to year. But 1.6 to 1.86 is not a super dramatic shift. Once we get to that 2019 and that more constrained data set, we see it go up to 2.9 units per acre, which when you consider that the target for a city is 3.5 units an acre for suburban edge, a 2.9, unit per acre shift in their density is very dramatic and would make it really difficult for communities to use this to reliably plan on what flexibility they'd have year to year. So that was a little bit of an alarm bell on our end. So high level, when we looked at all the data we got, our feeling was that the 2005 to 2010 scenarios just don't remove enough old data for most of the cities to have the impact we wanted to see. The 10 flat scenario, if you remember that last slide, had huge volatility. We had one city gaining 8 units an acre between the years. And also when we have cities that will report in a year 8 or 10 flats, it means their entire data set would be switching out every year, which doesn't give us a lot of consistency. Both the 2015 and 2019 scenarios really had that desired program impact on the program where we saw a nice increase and we still had good data sets for most cities. But the 2019, we began to get smaller data sets, especially for our slower growth cities. The 2015 scenario has a really nice feature in that it aligns 10 years of planning data. It's envisioned as a rolling scenario with the 10 years lens that we're looking at for evaluating that residential density. So it creates a pretty comparable amount of acreage and development for the credit program. And we also looked a lot at what these scenarios are gonna look out if they're in play for 5, 10, or 20 years and how that's gonna impact their data sets. Really our big goal is to find the balance where we have a data set that's small enough that cities can actually see a change and that it reflects what they're actually doing, but that's not so small that every year they have a massive spike and they can't reliably use it for flexibility credit. And then at that point, it's also not giving us great data. So with that, staff's recommendation is the same as it was when we presented this as an information item. The 2015 scenario, and then having a rider that if a city has recorded less than 10 flats in the last 10 years, they can use their last 10 most recent flats. That's a way of protecting our slower growth cities that are involved in the program from having super constrained data sets of 3 or 4 flats and letting us get a full picture of what they're doing. We do have some cities that will report a plat every 3 years, and we want to make sure that they still have a workable system. We think this strikes that really nice balance. It does also have the benefit about twice as many cities gain density as lose it in this. We didn't see a lot of volatility. It's also really easy to administer and explain to communities because every year the oldest year of data pops off and the newest year of data comes on. So you're not gonna see big shifts as you go between planning cycles or anything of that nature. The other thing that we thought was relevant in the determination between the 2015 and the 2019 scenario is when we look at when we expect communities to be using this program for their 2050 comprehensive plans, the data sets become almost identical. If a community submitted really early and used the 2027 flat monitoring data, the 2019 scenario would have 1 year less data than the 2010. And then it evens out if they're reporting using 2028 data. So we won't actually see any meaningful difference for most communities using the 2015-2019. But going forward, the 2015 will maintain that consistent 10-year. Again, the only real downside is it doesn't align really crisply with the 10-year planning cycle, but there's really not a practical scenario that does that. So that's the main recommendation. We did bring that recommendation to, yourselves in September. Generally what we heard is that you wanted us to find the scenario that benefited as many cities as possible, but while still maintaining the integrity of the data. We did also have a request that we should provide you with the city-by-city breakdown of how the different scenarios would impact the different communities. That was attached as a spreadsheet. So hopefully that gave you a sense of what type of shifts you were seeing in each community. We also took this to the Community Development Committee as an information item. They were supportive of the recommendation. We did have a question about whether or not there was a way we could provide credit to cities that were currently platting at above 3 units an acre, but which were not platting at the 3.5 units per acre. That's gonna be required by Imagine 2050 policy. It's something we looked into. Ultimately, we felt that the policy direction that the Metropolitan Council gave us in Imagine 2050 required us to maintain the integrity of the 3.5 units per acre guidance and the goals of reaching compact development. We also feel that with the shorter look back period, most communities are getting a bump to help them reach that 3.5. On average, communities' net density goes up by 0.37 units per acre, which is, almost half of that policy change, over half of that policy change difference. We're also exploring and proposing some additional flexibility in what can be netted out for the use implementation guidelines, which we'll be talking about later. And finally, when we really looked into it, there are 4 cities that are currently have a platted net density above 3 units an acre, but under 3.5. So it's a really small subset of program participants that would even be eligible for any benefit under that theoretical credit program. So that's the reason why we didn't pursue that or try to incorporate that. We also held a reconvening of the plat monitoring focus group. When I asked for general response to the recommendation, I got 6 floating thumbs up out of 11 participants, so I take that as a ringing endorsement. Yeah, jokes aside, nobody expressed any major concerns with this. We did have a couple cities ask to meet with me individually just to really dig into how it would individually impact their city. Those meetings were held. Folks didn't, no flashing red lights, no major concern for race on those. So I feel pretty comfortable saying that the plat monitoring communities, the feedback we've got is that they're either on board or okay with this. We don't have any strong objections out there. And just a reminder of who participated in the focus group. We did have a good spread. We had 11 communities out of 45 plat monitoring communities participated. Mostly suburban edge communities. We did have 1 suburban and I believe 2 rural centers off the top of my head. So again, pretty good distribution, good geographic, different communities. Feel pretty comfortable that we get that. With that, the proposed action is that the Land Use Advisory Committee forward these recommendations to the Community Development Committee for their consideration. For cities enrolled in the plat monitoring program, the Met Council will calculate net residential density by combining the average net density of the city's last 10 years of actual platting, or the average net density of the city's last 10 plats, if fewer than 10 plats have been recorded in the last 10 years, and the lowest allowable density on the land identified to support forecasted growth for the relevant staging period. Cities may elect not to have their plat monitoring program data included in the calculations. And 2, eligibility for the plat monitoring program should be restricted to cities with suburban edge and rural center designations. With that, I'd happily take any questions.
Questions, comments? Go ahead, Jerry.
Chair. When I drive around places, it seems like more apartments are going up. I think that the Met Council, that's what you guys want, I believe, that's why it's being done. If that's an accurate statement, does the Met Council have any planning or anything they're looking into? What happens 30 years from now if our populations start to decrease? You have all these apartment buildings. What are you gonna do with them? I mean, people would rather be in single family houses, but the Met Council wants you to be more dense than those. What are you gonna do with all these apartment buildings once the population decreases?
I mean, my short answer would be I would trust in the providence of the market. I think properties will continue to redevelop to meet changing demographic needs. I think, as we look out 30 years, while it's true that we might have a population where we have smaller household sizes and where population growth is slowing, we're also gonna have a lot more senior citizens who may not have the ability or interest in maintaining half-acre, quarter-acre, larger single-family lots. I have a feeling you'll see a lot of these apartments cycle into senior housing complexes and find use that way. But, it's gonna be fluid, and who knows, people might start having babies again too.
Good answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to add that we do in fact look out at our population projections as we have in Imagine 2050, which go out through the year 2050 as the title implies. And while we have seen, while we're expecting slowing growth over this planning horizon, we still expect to be a growing population. And I just want to clarify that the council, while we may be looking for more efficient use of land, does not mean it's all apartments all of the time. Single family, townhomes, duplexes, and other housing stock are all part of the picture that is needed to help support the forecasted population population we have today and the population we'll have in the future.
Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you, Chair. Dakota County, we have over 2,000 seniors on a wait list for senior housing. And I'd also say, I think it's 2040, state of Minnesota will be at 22.6%, I think, 65 and older. So we got a high demand, we're at 16% today, aging demographics. But I'd also say the market's changed. Young people are not buying big lots because of the cost of land and the cost of building. I live in a new development, small lots, 5 setbacks, 10 feet, and build them and sell them. So consumers are buying small lots. See it every day.
Go ahead, Lana.
Oh, and one of the things that we're doing as we look at development plans that come before us, we just approved a 35 unit assisted living. It's a small unit, but it has parking. It's an area that has parking challenges, and we approved it with less parking because it's currently an assisted living facility. But we know in our city, right now we are at about 25% seniors, and we have that long list too. But at some point down the road, we looked at, let's make sure that it's actually reusable. If there's ever a need that it doesn't need to be assisted, and then you swing it back to market apartments, making sure that the area still will support a different type of population coming in. So we don't think that they're going to want to go back to bigger houses. We think it could be a change in the demographics of that building.
You could just look at downtown Minneapolis, St. Paul, there's a lot of high rises that, the end users probably never thought would go from commercial to residential. They always probably assumed that there would be a high demand for these commercial spaces, but as we transition more into a hybrid model, hybrid workforce, where there's a lot more remote work, they're pivoting. And now they're turning those into affordable housings instead of being commercial high-rise buildings now. So as the demographic changes, the needs change, as the generations continue to change, buildings and developers and we will continue to adapt and continue to change. Right now you see the high demand for data centers, right? But who's to say those data centers go obsolete in 15, 20 years when technology changes, right? Then we will have to change those data centers to something else, whether it's, certain communities have done emergency pod housings in warehouses just like that. That can be something that it can be transitioned to more commercial space. We just have to adapt as things continue. And I think we've done, great with that, showing that this region does adapt as things continue to change, and we will continue to adapt. You had something else, Jerry?
Well, I don't know. Does anybody here have a crystal ball? I don't.
No.
I mean, what's to say what things are gonna be like in 2060, let's say? One doesn't know. I certainly wouldn't venture a guess. Seems like we're putting all your eggs in one basket by making it more dense. But, You know, I'm just an old-fashioned country boy, but, you know.
And one thing this is a great comment, nobody knows actually what's happening, but the price of labor, the price of material will not be going down as we continue to move forward, right? So you're going to see this, the swift change from those large properties to acreage to let's get to something more reasonable and affordable as things continue to change. So right now, I love my property. I wouldn't want to go into something where it's 1,000 square feet for me and my family, but who's to say in 15 years, I might change my mind and be like, well, I can sell my house and live cheaper in an apartment or a townhouse. And things will change. But, you know, just keep in mind, material and labor will not get cheaper as we progress. It'll continue to increase and land will not get cheaper. It'll get more expensive as we continue further down the line. That's the only thing that is guaranteed.
That's a fact. Nothing goes down, except wages, but.
Yep, yeah, go
I
ahead.
had a question on part 2 of the motion here, that it is exclusive to the suburban edge and rural center communities. I noticed on the background slide that there are existing participants that don't fall into those designations, and I'm wondering what that, if you could provide clarity on that.
Yeah, so there's 5 participants that are classified as suburban communities. When we looked at the data, especially the community by community breakdown, we saw massive swings in the change in net to average density for those communities. What's happened is when those 5 communities joined the program 20 years ago or 15 years ago, as the case may be, they were still doing greenfield development. They were still doing, you know, single family subdivisions. They've now switched entirely to infill, which is reflected by their suburban category. So when they entered the program, regional policy was for them to be 3 units an acre because they were part of the developing edge. Now their suburban community is required to meet 7 units an acre. And the plat monitoring program is really no longer very relevant for them. They are so far over the policy density, and all of their developments coming in are so high. It doesn't seem like a good fit to continue to have that group and their data set mixed in with the developing edge communities that are still doing greenfield. So that's the impetus for that change proposed. And I think, you know, you see that a little bit in the, that's not clicked up to that. You know, in this chart, where under the current, we have 3 of those 5 communities not meeting their policy, and it's because they have so much legacy greenfield low density development on. And then once we drop to the 2019 data and pull all that off and look at what they've been doing under their current comprehensive plan, only 1 of the communities is under that 7. So that was the impetus for kind of reevaluating it and reorienting it back to the developing edge communities.
Thank you.
Christos?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, so I had a question very similar. So when I was looking at back in the background, sort of the color map of the region, it looks like the only suburban community that was a part of the focus group is Plymouth.
That is correct.
And I was just curious, and maybe you've already answered that, but if they shared anything in the focus group as to what their concerns might be, because if under number 2 they're excluded, it seems like it may just be like they don't care anymore because their density is increased to a point that it doesn't apply to them.
I do not recall any specific comments from the city of Plymouth during the focus group. Looking.
If I may interject, I work for the city of Plymouth, and all of our development is, as you say, infill development. I think we have like 2 more fields left to develop, but now it's hundreds of units of apartments that are going in these old kind of commercial areas. So I wasn't in the focus group, but I would imagine it would be a similar anecdote from our planning department.
Yeah, and Plymouth, I mean, using their 2019 data, they're doing 7.02 units per acre is what they've recorded. I think their land use is probably gonna be comfortably in there too. Can't speak for them, of course.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? No, I'd entertain a motion.
I move the staff recommendation.
Thank you.
Second.
Second, all right, any discussion? None, all in favor, please signify by aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Ayes have it, motion passes. Thank you. And we'll move over to our information item, use implementation guidelines update. Mackenzie.
So another thing that Imagine 2050 committed Metropolitan Council doing is looking at and updating the guidelines we use for reviewing expansions to the municipal urban service area, our MUSA implementation guidelines. So for today's discussion, I'm gonna give a brief background on what the MUSA is, very briefly a little bit about the current guidelines, and then I'm gonna talk about proposed changes and some next steps. So what is the MUSA? The MUSA is the existing developments in the region that have wastewater service and the areas that are planned to have wastewater surface through 2050, so those areas that are planned to develop. It's basically what is and what will be served by the sanitary sewer system. Now MUSA isn't just wastewater, it's also water, it's also transit, it's the full spread of urban services. But generally, when we're talking about with our cities, what they're most concerned about is the Met Council going to provide us with sewer system service? So that's gonna be a lot of the focus point of our conversation today. MUSA needs to be understood as the council's commitment to provide sewer service to an area. If something's within the MUSA, we have told the city that when it develops, it will have a hookup and will be served by our system. So MUSA is pretty intricately linked to community designations. It's reflected in the urban and rural service area divide. So cities classified as urban, urban edge, suburban edge are within the MUSA. Rural centers are interesting because even though most of them do not currently have connections to the Metropolitan Council's sewer service, they are in our long-term service area, which means at some point we anticipate they will connect and be served, and that means they are also in the MUSA. And then diversified rural, residential and agriculture are outside of the MUSA. The difference policy-wise is for areas within the MUSA, we require the cities to meet minimum densities, net average residential densities. For the areas outside, they're required to have a maximum density, so we limit how dense they can be. And there's a lot of reasons for that policy that aren't incredibly linked to this, but just wanted to mention that note. Community designation is based not just on the MUSA, it's also percentage of developed land, intersection density, and things of that nature. But moving on, community designation determines policy expectations for communities. A lot of the policy that applies under Imagine 2050 is related to what community designation a community is assigned. So, communities need to have conformance, consistency, and compatibility with our system and policy plans. Imagine 2050 has policies that include the forecasts, the community designations I talked about before, as well as the water policy plan. The water policy plan is where the wastewater system plan is, and the wastewater system plan discusses our commitment to accommodating sewer growth. So cities need to conform to that wastewater system plan by identifying how they are going to accommodate the forecasted growth. And they need to provide land to accommodate that, both developed and then reserving and undeveloped, and then they need to preserve areas for long-term growth outside of the 2050 planning period. And that's the conformance piece of the check. So this Imagine 2050 policy at a very high level is then implemented and reiterated at the local level through their comprehensive plans. The comprehensive plans guide the community's growth and development, and that has to be guided in line with the density policy in Imagine 2050 and the community designations. the comprehensive plan identifies where, when, and how development is going to occur in a community. And it does have a water component because communities have to have a CIP plan, so a capital improvement plan, in their comprehensive plan, which outlines their local infrastructure expansion. And then that is reviewed against our own infrastructure plans to make sure that we're gonna have the sewer capacity to serve the areas that the city's gonna bring on and develop with sewer. So it's definitely a bit of an iterative process. And I will mention that all zoning and other approvals do need to be consistent then with the land use and staging plans that are in that comprehensive plan. So it gets a little more granular when we get to the staging that we see here. So the comprehensive plan talked about the when, where, and how the city is gonna accommodate growth. The staging plan is the granular resolution of that the local government identifies for us. This is the city of Shakopee and their staging plan. Usually these are broken up into 10-year periods, so you can see the different colors correspond to a 10-year staging period. The city looks at its growth rate, looks at its land consumption, looks at where it's making its local infrastructure investments, and then says, this area is gonna develop in this decade, this area will develop in the subsequent decade. And that's what the city, what the Metropolitan Council cross-checks when we evaluate this is our regional system going to have the capacity to take the land that's coming in line in each individual decade? This isn't static. Cities can amend this through comprehensive plan amendments. It can be amended during the comprehensive plan update period. Whatever areas are added to the MUSA, the staging area, or added to a decade, we also then review and verify and make sure our infrastructure can support. And depending on the scale and duration, there may be times when the Metropolitan Council may even time and alter our investments to make sure that we're gonna have the capacity we need to accommodate the growth that's coming online in various decades. So it is a bit of an iterative process. We are continually monitoring development in the region to make sure there is an adequate land supply. Some of how we do that is by tracking comprehensive plan amendments, sewer connection permits, the plat monitoring data that we've been discussing previously, as well as cities filling out a building permit survey, letting us know what's actually being built. So we're always keeping an eye on this. Our big goal is to balance, we don't wanna have such a constricted land supply that we're increasing the cost of development due to land scarcity. We also don't wanna have so much land in the MUSA that we're putting pressure on rural areas, causing the premature expansion of regional infrastructure, which is expensive and we don't wanna build until we actually need it to serve areas. So it is a bit of a balancing act, and the goal of the MUSA implementation guidelines is to properly strike that balance. A little bit of history, the first ever MUSA that I could find was the 2000 MUSA. It was established in 1986. Very quickly after establishing it, cities began to ask if it could be modified, if this part can be added. And the council very quickly realized we needed a fair and consistent process to evaluate those expansion and alteration requests. So that was the impetus for the original MUSA expansion guidelines. We wanted to create a fair process to evaluate requests and a transparent process. It's been updated numerous times since then. Typically it gets updated every time, at the very least whenever a new regional development guide goes into effect. Because obviously when we adopt new policy, we need to make sure that all of our guidelines and implementation measures reflect the policy adopted. Most recently, there was a minor update in 2023, and before that in 2017, it was adopted to reflect Thrive 2040. The current guidelines reflect Thrive 2040's policy with the 3 unit per acre overall density for the areas that typically we're expanding, which is the suburban edge and emerging suburban edge. It outlined how the plat monitoring program would provide credit, exempted publicly owned stormwater facilities on outlots, and then also had text that dealt with how failing septic systems would be treated when they needed to be added, with different policies for communal systems and individual systems. And other changes have been added throughout the years. But Imagine 2050 did also have some specific MUSA policy And based on that, we are proposing updates to align the implementation guidelines with that policy direction. So first one I won't go into much detail on, but because the MUSA implementation guidelines stipulate how plat monitoring data will be used, the plat monitoring program changes that were just forwarded as a recommendation from this body today will be incorporated into the MUSA implementation guidelines. So it'll replace the current practice of including all data with a shorter look back period, assuming that's what ultimately gets adopted. And then we do very explicitly in the MUSA guidelines specify exactly how that math is gonna be used to calculate. And again, because plat monitoring is always a credit program, communities can choose not to have included if it would lower their net residential density and create a problem for them in that regard. The other area where we align density with new policy is looking at what areas are eligible to be excluded from density calculations. So directly from Imagine 2050's language, areas where there is insufficient depth to bedrock or water table are areas that can be netted out or removed from the area where density calculation is occurring. The proposal is to expand the area under stormwater BMPs that can be netted out. Under the current guidelines, only city-owned outlots are eligible. Under this, stormwater BMPs owned and maintained by a city would be eligible, even if the city doesn't technically own the land they're under. So if a city puts an easement over an outlot or over the back of residential properties and builds the stormwater pond there, as long as the city owns and maintains it, we would recognize that as a publicly owned and maintained improvement that's eligible to be netted out. In line with the council's goal of preserving and protecting open spaces, publicly owned conservation easements are also proposed now to be eligible to be netted out. And in line with the council's goal of encouraging infill development, local and collector right-of-way only in cases where there's infill development with an existing street grid is now proposed to be netted out. And we think that'll release some of the constraints on some of the oddly shaped legacy parcels or redevelopments where it's hard to get nice, clean, perfectly set up lots because you're constrained by all the infrastructure that was built 50 years ago. So we believe that it'll give the cities a little bit more flexibility there. Another goal was just to be really clear with how the Metropolitan Council evaluates things. So we spelled out very explicitly how we determine consistency with regional policy for sewer extension permits. And we also included then a new clarifier. So under current policy, when a development comes in for a sewer extension permit, we look at the phase that's applying for it in isolation without necessarily looking at the entire development that was approved. We recognize that when developments come before a city, they're looking at it as an entire project, and they're not looking at it necessarily when they're doing their density, consistency with comprehensive plan, check. They're not necessarily looking at the individual phase, they're looking at, say, all three phases of a larger residential subdivision. And there's cases where maybe phase one is all of that stormwater infrastructure and houses, but then doesn't have any of the wetlands or parks that can be netted out. So that phase one looks like it's outside of density policy, but really when you look at phase 1, 2, and 3, the development's right where it should be. So we wanted to align our review process with how we know cities are doing their review process, so that we don't have disconnects where because a developer broke a phase up, and had this block in one phase and not another, it was dipping just under or just outside of the policy range. This doesn't change the fact that developments always need to fall within the land use the city's established. So if a development has, say a high density component and a low density component, the high density still needs to fall within the high density range and the low density needs to fall within the low density. They wouldn't be able to do, say, medium density and say, well, if we mix it up, it's the same. But it does give a little bit more alignment with how we look at it and how cities improve it. Hopefully that was clear. If not, I can take questions now or we could wait till the end.
Lana?
I have a question, just about what you were talking about, how you're gonna go from looking at phase to the whole project. what about the risk of them never completing the phases that actually have the bodies that would warrant the reduction?
So that gets to why we don't allow the land use to be averaged out. So in the situation where I'm looking at phases, it'd be the entire area I'm looking at, we're gonna say is low density residential, right? Required to be 2 to 5 units an acre, whatever, I'll just use that as an example. We would need an approved preliminary plat. So preliminary plats give the developer entitlement to build those units. As long as they meet the conditions of the preliminary plat, the city has to approve the final plat. So for the developer not to build those units, the developer's walking away from money, which, is typically not gonna happen. We also know that, so what we're looking at then is phase 1 comes in, and because the developer had to build all the stormwater infrastructure in the first phase, right? Let's say in this case, the stormwater infrastructure can't be netted out, just due to however they put it in an HOA lot, we'll say. That pushes that first phase to like 1.8. Well, we know all of that stormwater infrastructure was designed to take all of the units in phase 2 and 3. So we know phase 2 and 3 are gonna be built at their units. We've seen the preliminary plat, we know that there's, a wetland that can be dented out, we're very confident it's gonna go forward. So phase 2 is 2.5 units an acre, phase 3 is 3 point what, the math works out and we're comfortable with that. We do have a clause in there that if something happens and they subsequently amend that preliminary plat so that it no longer conforms with regional policy, at that point the sewer extension permit would be denied until a comprehensive plan amendment was submitted to reconcile and address that discrepancy.
But that would only stop phase 2. Do you have any requirement that says that water treatment must happen in the first phase? What if they weren't gonna do their remediation of water treatment until a later phase?
Not a water resources engineer, do not believe that would be possible. Your MS4 permit's gonna require you to deal with the abstraction of the first, 1.1? I'm not gonna go too far out of my lane, but they have to abstract rate and flow and not have an increase. They cannot build the development without doing that. It's not possible for them to have that mitigation be in a subsequent phase. They have to front load that. And again, because the preliminary plat does have legal standing and is an entitlement, we are comfortable using that as the lens for our review. It quite frankly just makes sense. It gets difficult to explain to a city that they need to do a comp plan amendment because a developer put one block of houses in phase 1 instead of phase 2.
Thank you.
Christos?
Mr. Chair, this is back to slide 8. Under the current guidelines, and I apologize if other folks know this, but the current guidelines, the last one says it excludes areas with failing subsurface sewage treatment systems, except for failing communal subsurface treatment systems, which must be included. I guess I'm just wondering if you have an example of what that might look like for us.
Yeah, so the failing individual subsurface would be, say my city, we have an old legacy property, it's a 2.5 acre lot, it's a septic system, they've just never connected to the city system, comes back with a failing test. There's really nothing much the city can do, it has to connect to their system, we can't have the environmental contaminant. In that case, because it's an individual property, we would allow the city to connect that to the regional system, and we wouldn't take that 2.5 acres and add it to their density table and have them need to offset that. Because it's one home, it's one individual, so these individual systems are exempted, it's a way to prevent environmental problems. With the communal systems, those tend to be larger systems that are serving a neighborhood, a business, a more significant piece of land. In those cases, when that's coming on, we believe it's appropriate that the city needs to offset the impact of adding that much land to the regional system at a lower density. So you might have 22 acre lots on that communal system. In which case we would add the acreage, if there's 22 acre lots, 40 acres to the city's overall, land expected to develop in the future area. We would note the density it's at, and the city would be required to guide future land at a high enough density to ensure that in the end, the city was still gonna have a citywide net average density that met regional policy. So that's where that distinction comes in and how it's treated.
Thank you.
Dan?
I have to remember what I was gonna ask now. Oh, so on the, I think it's on the next, on slide 10, and I think I've heard a little bit about it already, I recall a number of cases where we required the stormwater EMPs to be on an HOA lot. And the city ended up later having responsibility for maintenance of those. So we don't own it, and it's on an HOA lot, so it doesn't necessarily get caught, but ultimately we're responsible for maintaining it. I'm not sure that that gets captured in this set of criteria, and maybe we need to do things differently, or maybe the criteria maybe needs to be different, I'm not sure. Or maybe it's a small enough case that it doesn't matter, but I just wanted to point that out, that that's out there in some cases too, and I'm not sure how prevalent that is.
We'll be talking a little bit more about stormwater ponds later, especially some comments we had from the focus group. I will say that staff is certainly aware of those situations. We tried to capture that by, really focusing on who has the assigned ownership and maintenance responsibility under the easement. So if it's on an HOA lot, but the easement says the city has access, the city has operations and maintenance responsibilities, that can be netted out just as if it was on one of your outlots. If that easement says the HOA is responsible for maintaining it, then it can't be. And part of the reason for that is just what you said. Frankly, we're not convinced HOAs always fulfill their maintenance responsibilities.
Okay, thank you.
Did you think of a question, Jerry?
No.
Alright, so I just finished with determining consistency with regional policy, which means we are on to incorporating the Imagine 2050 policy around new criteria for expanding the MUSA. Cities, because I talked about, we want to strike that balance between ensuring we have adequate land supply, but not creating unnecessary or premature development pressure on our rural areas. All of the forecasts, all of the projections we have show that in almost every area, there is enough land in the 2050 MUSA to accommodate the 2050 forecasts. So the 2040 MUSA, which is now the 2050 MUSA, there wasn't a need to expand it. So cities requesting expansions to the MUSA will need to demonstrate that there is actually a need for additional land, that they don't have that rolling 20-year land supply. That can be done through a forecast amendment. It can be done through bringing us aware of, local factors that may constrain development in ways we're not aware of that necessitate additional land being added. We want to provide clear guidance on how this provision would apply for cities that are up against townships and either do or do not have orderly annexation agreements, where they're going to need to grow through annexation, and how they can meet that criteria. And then we also wanted to provide some guidance for how the MUSA expansion request can be resolved if the need cannot be demonstrated. So we have the provision that, really the concern is no net increase, so communities can voluntarily basically rearrange land in their border, take some land out to add it in another place. Or there can be other solutions that are mutually agreed upon to address the situation. So again, the goal here is really clarity so that cities can feel very confident in knowing when a mutual expansion request will be approved and what steps they're gonna need to make it. We really wanted to find that balance between having a static line, which could constrain growth, and then also making sure that we're not just allowing expansions that underline the goal of orderly and efficient growth in the region. So that was the impetus for those. Really the goal is always to protect the integrity of the regional systems, which brings me to the last proposed change. So this change would require that new areas connecting to the MUSA accommodate, going back. This is for mandated connections. There are very rare circumstances where the Metropolitan Council is required to connect an area to the MUSA that we had never previously contemplated serving. These areas often will not be consistent with regional policy. And so what we are proposing is a structure that would allow the council to evaluate placing a land inefficiency surcharge on those areas. The rationale for that is basically that had those areas been developed in line with regional policy, we could have economically and efficiently served them. Because they have a development pattern that is not consistent with regional policy, there are costs to that inefficient land use that are being borne by other communities in the system. And we want to make sure that communities that have developed their land efficiently in a way that conforms with regional policies are not subsidizing communities or areas that chose not to develop in that manner. This is not an addition to the sewer availability charge. This is a separate fee. The way the MUSA guidelines are written is, we use a lot of conditional language because we recognize these situations are very rare and each one is very unique. So we wanted an option to do this. It would always be done as a result of a direct study, looking at the area in question, its impact to the system, and to determine what type of fee would be appropriate and reasonable. This creates the scaffolding for that. It doesn't establish a set fee and it doesn't commit us to necessarily charging a fee. So hopefully that provides a little bit of clarity on where we're going with that. If we have any, I'll do another pause with the chair's permission, and if there are any other timely questions.
Go ahead, Wanda.
Just the way the second bullet talks about the inefficiency surcharge, is that surcharge to the entity that's not done appropriate planning? Is that what this is saying, and it's not to the whole region?
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
It would be to the community requesting the MUSA extension.
Go ahead, Dan.
Is that known as the North Oaks rule?
Nope, it's designed to be a blanket policy. There are many instances where this could come up.
Okay. No, I was just curious, because their situation and being sort of a neighbor of theirs, I've been aware of their challenges, a lot of failing septic systems on large private lots and desire to connect to the system. And the challenges associated with that, so it's just been an interesting case to follow without any skin in the game.
Sure.
So I'm just kind of curious. It seems like everything that goes on down here is about planning, of course. Does the Met Council, in their planning of things, take into fact what areas of the Twin Cities can be developed because the transportation structure would allow it? Or, I mean, what does the Met Council put first, the cart or the horse?
I think I see the shape of your question. So, generally speaking, I will say, the Metropolitan Council allocates forecasted growth based on geographically where we think that growth is going to occur. That is based in part on, lines of transportation where people can get to a course. It's based on where communities have guided land and what densities the community has chosen to guide that land in their comprehensive plans. So there's a bit of a feedback, right, where communities have said we're gonna put high density growth, we assume high density growth will go and our models allocate it there. That being said, if we're getting to, things like transit infrastructure, it's not practicable to build transit infrastructure before there's enough units to have the ridership to make it economically viable. That being said, we don't go out and say, McKenzieville, you're gonna take 10,000 units because we'd really like to build a bus line out to you someday. That's not at all how growth is appropriated. It'd be based on what our fictional city that my coworkers are sick of me talking about has guided for its growth, what land they have available, and how our model sees, people choosing to locate in that area.
And Mr. Chair, if I may, just to put a plug in about long-term transit planning, from Ramsey County, I have Purple Line in my district that's been studied for well over 20 years. And then also, it used to be Rush Line to go up to Rush City. And so it really requires city participation and support too. So White Bear Lake pulled out, and then Maplewood said that they wouldn't support a full BRT project that's, fully dedicated for buses. So we had to go back to the drawing board. So the counties help plan some of those transit projects along with city partners too. And then I sit on the tab and also see where routes would support our communities as well, and similar to what you said about density, they're not gonna select it for advancing it, ABRT even, the RTO, BRT, kind of like the A line and B line, they're not going to advance it unless if the density is there yet. So right now in my district, we have the Heights, that's 1,000 units being built. Like, that's not even considered Larpenteur quite yet because it hasn't been fully built out yet. So that's just an example of where some of the work intersects with both land use and transit.
Thank you.
So a little bit of the feedback we got, this has gone before the Community Development Committee as an information item. Just highlighting a couple of their questions. One of the things that they asked us is if there were areas where cities have asked for flexibility in exclusions from I should phrase it just as requested areas that can be excluded from net density calculations, which staff has not included in the MUSA implementation guidelines. The answer is yes. Some communities have indicated that they would prefer it if no local roads were included in the density calculations and it was just lot area only. Others have indicated that they would like to have private open spaces removed. Ultimately, we really looked at a consistent through line where we drew a distinction between public and private ownership and local and regional benefit. Things that were publicly owned and conveyed a city or region-wide benefit, were excluded. And things that were, specific to the development, infrastructure needed for that development, or privately owned, are things that need to be included in the density calculations. So that's the line that we looked at when we made those determinations on which areas made sense to be allowed to be netted out and which should be included in the density calculations. We also had a request for clarification on what would happen if a city wanted to expand their MUSA and the council disagreed that the MUSA needed to be expanded. So we went through how they can use things like, their forecasts, growth, more specific information on land availability, to demonstrate that need for the expansion of the MUSA. And then we also mentioned, that there are other things that cities could do, like removing one area to add it somewhere else so that there's no net change. And as well as the ability to come to a different arrangement, based on the unique characteristics. There was also a request that this be forwarded to the environmental committee so that they could provide input on the proposed guidelines. That will be happening on December 9th. So, in addition to the CDC, we also had the plat monitoring focus group review these guidelines and provide some feedback. One of the things that they felt really strongly on was the public versus private ownership of the stormwater BMPs. They felt that because in either case, the land needs to be used for the stormwater pond to meet their MS4 permit requirements, that the land was not eligible to development. It's not like it can magically, be turned into housing. And therefore they didn't feel like ownership was that pertinent to its impact on the development's density. As we touched on a little bit earlier in our conversation today, we do believe there is a valid distinction between public and private ownership, and that public ownership provides a higher standard of care, a more consistent standard of care. We also believe that when these features are privately owned, there is a chance that they get commingled with private amenities. You know, you build a nice walking trail and fountain in the stormwater pond, and now it's serving as a private park for the HOA resident rather than as a public facility. So while we hear their concern, we do believe there is a distinction between the public and private ownership. They believed that the Metropolitan Council should be more flexible with how we allow density to be averaged out within developments. Essentially that, you know, in the case of a mixed residential neighborhood, we shouldn't be concerned if part of it's high density and part of it's low density, as long as the average number of units fell within the total range, that it was not necessary to look at the location. We do not believe that would align with state law. State law requires that the land use plan, land use map, and the zoning map be in alignment. That requires that your density ranges that your zoning is allowing fall within the density ranges established by your land use. There isn't a mechanism that can jump or short circuit that in our opinion. So that's one where I think we're probably just gonna have to agree to disagree. I don't think we can get beyond that. There was also a really interesting discussion on how road right of way is treated, based on how it's historically established. Essentially what it comes down to is, due to some peculiarities in how different counties and areas have dedicated road right of way over the years, there are times when it's not included in a development when under strictest policy it probably should be. And other times, you know, where it might be included where maybe under strictest policy it shouldn't be. These guidelines aren't back looking, you know, with 188 jurisdictions and decades of history. There's gonna be some weird ones that don't fall neatly into stuff. And we think the most important thing is just consistently treating stuff moving forward. But I just brought that up as a third point of conversation. With that, just so you know, next steps, we're gonna get feedback from this body today. Go back to the CDC as well, Environmental Committee. We're gonna do some engagement with the Regional Planners Advisory Group. The Local Planners Focus Group asked to talk with me a little bit more about some of the issues that was brought up in their feedback. We're gonna be having another meeting with them in December to, you know, have further conversations, learn more about their perspective, and that'll be brought back to you as well. And then ultimately, this will come forward as a business item early next year. With that, I think I'm done talking. I should have brought water.
Any other questions, comments?
I do have one question for you. The difference between public and private and what you can control. Let's say we have a golf course in our city and it's privately owned. And we have nothing in our comp plan that's forecasting any density on there. And what if the owner decides to sell and it's going to become developed and we have not forecasted for any of that sewer, for instance? Are we considered to be one of your non-compliant in terms of forecasting?
So hypotheticals are a little hard, especially when I don't have a map in front of me. But I think I can say, you know, in that case, what would happen is you would do a comprehensive plan amendment to establish, you know, a land use in line with how you saw that area developing. At that point then, if it's not currently in the MUSA, our MUSA implementation guidelines trigger, right? And we look, is that land use you're establishing consistent with density policy for your community? You know, if the answer is yes, we're in a pretty good shape. The way the MUSA guidelines are written is if there's a no unanticipated development, we have a bit of a lower bar, right? Because you have a purchase offer on that property, because you have a plan going forward, we basically consider that to have shown that you actually do have, need for that land. If you're just saying, well, now we think this golf course might develop and we want to extend the MUSA over it, that's where we look at the forecasted growth and have that conversation, like, does the MUSA really need to expand, or do you have enough land currently within your community and MUSA to accommodate your forecasted growth? And the hypotheticals can spin out from there, right? You may need a forecast adjustment because we now have a live development that has 1,000 units going on a golf course we never envisioned. But the bottom line is, through the comprehensive plan amendment process, there is going to be a way to accommodate that consistent with policy. Now, you might need to move some other land around, or you might need to change guidance of a different area to make sure you meet density policy. Can't, even begin to speculate on that here. But it's not like if you didn't identify it for growth in your 2050 plan, it's now locked off until 2060 plan. If that makes sense.
Go ahead, Bill.
To give you a real life example, the FedEx building in Rosemount on 4252 is a golf course 5 years ago, compact plan. It's a warehouse, fortunately, very little sewer water. But it consumed 100 of the 160 and it's commercial now.
Any other comments, questions? No? All right, we'll move on to preparing for potential system statements hearing. Oh, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. So Chair and committee members, I'm here today with Kate Lowitz, who is also on the local planning assistance team, to give a deep dive into the system statement hearing process in preparation for potential participation by the committee in reviewing disputes to system statements. So we will kind of give you some background. Kate will help frame the background and purpose of the system statements. I'll walk through the hearing process with you and share some history of that, if we have time for that hearing work in previous planning cycles. I may have to call on the Executive Director of Community Development, who is our historian on some of those hearing histories. She has the longest tenure and experience with the hearings, so. Oh goodness, what happened? Sorry. Time's up, is that what you said? Oh goodness, it's 8:90. Yep. So, just a little bit of love. Okay, hopefully you'll recall in your onboarding materials for those that are new or for those that are longer serving members in on experience, that the Land Use Advisory Committee has a statutory role in evaluating disputes to the contents of system statements, which the council issues every 10 years after the regional development guide is updated. The system statements were distributed for this planning cycle in September. So the 60-day dispute period is nearing its end. Before we get too far into the conversation, I want to make sure that we all have the same understanding of system statements. So I'll ask Kate to help with some of the background and purpose for system statements.
Okay, so let's orient ourselves in the regional planning cycle for a moment, because this is a 10-year cycle. Back in February, the adoption of the Regional Development Guide triggered the creation of 2025 system statements, which were distributed to communities in about the third week of September. The distribution of system statements has kicked off the start of the next round of local comprehensive plan updates for the 2050 planning horizon. Statute dictates when system statements must be issued, the content of the statements, and the process to manage disputes from local governments after the issuance of the statements. System statements are issued when the council updates or revises its comprehensive development guide, and in this case, after the adoption in February of the mentioned 2050. We refer to these as decennial system statements. However, when system plans are updated more often than the regional development guide, we will also distribute what we call mid-cycle system statements. Last time we did in 2022. So the purpose of a system statement is a individualized document for each local unit of government that includes forecasted growth, development expectations, and key changes to regional policy plans. Customized for each community, they detail a plan, detailed system plan impacts specific to a municipality for the next planning horizon. So we knew overall with this project, we needed 188 custom statutory documents, going from land use and our visions and goals to transportation, water policy, and our regional parks and trails system as well. So we critically reviewed the 2015 and 2022 system statements projects. And we knew that we needed to have a detailed file management process and tracking processes for this entire project because we had to manage over 2,400 maps and 750 documents to distill them into 188 custom documents. So that would be 3 divisions and 9 work groups that we worked with in the council. So in terms of how these all kind of work together with the RDG, system statements contain information on regional systems and how the regional development guide directly impacts each community. The local planning handbook is the region's technical assistance resource for comprehensive plan updates with clear instructions, interactive tools, community data, and more. So this year, local planning assistance has overhauled the handbook website to be used along the 2025 system statements to write 2050 comprehensive plans.
So hearings are conducted to consider amendments to system statements that are requested by the community. It's a normal part of the process to reconcile disagreements over the content in a system statement. It gives the local government an opportunity for the Land Use Advisory Committee or the Office of Administrative Hearings to hear those disagreements and to hear proposed amendments to the system statement. So as I mentioned, system statements were mailed the week of September 22nd. We have a team of staff called sector representatives that work with individual cities when there's a question, a clarification, or an area of disagreement. The first step we encourage communities to use is to call your sector rep, please do. But the vast majority of questions can get resolved at that point. A lot of times it's just clarifications like, are you sure what does this mean for my community? Just some clarifying points. However, if at that point there is no resolution, we then have to conduct a hearing within 60 days. They have to request a hearing within 60 days. Within that, then we also have to hold that hearing within 60 days of that. There is a little bit more flexibility in statute since the last time that we did this because it allows communities and the council to come to an agreed upon schedule as opposed to strictly adhering to 60-day timelines where communities may not have enough time to put materials together. Council meetings and scheduling can sometimes be a challenge as well. But a report then, after a hearing is held, is made within 30 days. And ultimately, the Met Council makes the final determination based on that report. So when requesting a hearing, the local government must describe the disagreement in addition to actually requesting a hearing, providing a resolution requesting that hearing. They actually have to describe the area of disagreement. They must include specific amendments that they're asking for to a system statement. And as I mentioned, the local government can choose to have that hearing either in front of this body or with an administrative law judge as part from the Office of Administrative Hearings. Both are allowed in statute, both are great, and there's a different role for each of those groups. Communities often ask for hearings at LUAC to keep the costs down. Those costs are typically split between the local government and the council. LUAC provides an opportunity for the local government to be heard by its peers, as the majority of this committee is locally elected officials. And all members have an understanding of local and regional planning, as well as experience working with land use issues. The Office of Administrative Hearings offers the the local government unit, an opportunity to be heard by an administrative law judge who typically has experience hearing cases on rulemaking, data practices, operation of government programs, and other areas. The Land Use Advisory Committee or the Office of Administrative Hearings will conduct the hearing and draft a report to the council. LUAC is well qualified to make recommendations just based on your experience as local government participants, local government elected officials, but also because of the work that you do within this committee. So first, all members were appointed based on their background in land use issues, but projects that the committee has worked on over time also include the analysis which crafted the community designations which were adopted as part of Imagine 2050. This committee also provided feedback on various aspects of Imagine 2050, including the vision, values, and goals, but also, and most importantly to this committee, the land use objectives, policies, and actions. And then, of course, that includes the density conversation, which was a robust conversation last year. The committee's work plan since adoption of Imagine 2050 really includes a lot of implementation program evaluations and updates, some of which you heard from Mackenzie just now. But they're all in support of local comprehensive planning. As I mentioned, the use implementation guidelines just being one of those. So with LUAC or the Office of Administrative Hearing role in conducting the hearing and in drafting the report, ultimately it's the Met Council's role to receive and review that report and ultimately make the final determination as to whether or not to amend the system statement as requested by the city or by the local government. I do want to mention too that in 2019 there was a change in law that we should just mention. Any hearing on system statements may now consider the need for or reasonableness of the metropolitan system plans or parts thereof. What does that mean? This change really broadens the considerations allowed as part of the hearings. Previously, the council's system plans for transportation, regional parks, and wastewater were set and adopted as by the council, and we essentially the organization through a lot of public engagement, obviously through development of plans, determined what was in those plans itself. So they couldn't contest whether or not it was reasonable to have a system component in their system statement or a different piece of the plan in their system statement itself. And now those can be considered. However, what we would recommend is really based in what's in the Metropolitan Land Planning Act as it relates to comprehensive planning itself. So considering forecasts, considering timing, character, function, location, and other conditions as part of metropolitan system plans to really focusing on those aspects of the system statement. This is a very in-depth schedule of what would happen if a hearing was actually to come before this committee. We would walk through all of those aspects. You wouldn't be expected to drive that process yourself. We also obtain outside counsel to facilitate that process as well, so this is a neutral body. You can see that the local government and the council would each submit pre-hearing information. The LUAC would then hold a hearing where both parties would be present to have testimony and exhibit. You would be able to ask questions within 30 days after the hearing. At a LUAC meeting, you would review proposed findings and conclusions from both parties. Make recommendations on findings and conclusions, drafting that report and sending that report to the council, including the recommended cost allocation in the report. Ultimately, within 30 days of receiving the report, the Met Council would make a decision on whether or not proposed amendments to the system statement would be made. So since this only happens once every 10 years, I thought it would be helpful to kind of hear some examples of what has happened in the past with various hearings that have come before the council. I may have to defer to Lisa, but I will start by saying issues in 2005, and to think that this is the same over many, over the last 30 years that I'm aware of. The primary issues really revolve around forecasts and what used to be called geographic planning areas, but are now called community designations, and because that determines what kind of systems and services are available within your community. As the wastewater system expands, there's a lot of work between local governments and the council, and oftentimes the timing and staging of when improvements will be made to the system or extension of the system would be had, and that's common in system statement conversations still today. In 2005, I think that was primarily related to potential annexation hearings. So there were 5 hearings ultimately that were held in that planning period. Carver, the city of Carver, Hassan Township, which is actually now a part of the city of Rogers, Hugo, Lake Elmo, and Shorewood. And you can see the various issues that were resolved and discussed as part of those requests for hearing. As I mentioned, just because the community requests the hearing doesn't mean that a hearing will ultimately be held, because we can continue to have conversation, negotiate, and come to a mutual resolution where possible. So outcomes for 2005-2006 time period, a hearing was held for the city of Lake Elmo, where the Met Council determined that no amendments would be made to the system statement. For that particular one, a park and ride as part of the transportation policy plan was an issue, and then usually making changes to geographic planning areas through the process of updating or amending comprehensive plans, and they had requested that as part of the system statement. A hearing was also held for the city of Carver. The hearing held at the community's request after a stipulation of settlement was agreed upon. So a stipulation is a written agreement to resolve differences over the contents of that system statement. When I mentioned that a community and the council can come to a mutually agreed negotiation between the time they actually request a hearing and the need to hold that hearing, they do that through, we would do that through a stipulation, a stipulated agreement. Those are formal documents, but it does mean that a hearing wouldn't be necessary. In this time period, Carver still wanted to have the hearing, even though we had come to a stipulated agreement. Requests were withdrawn due to stipulations for Hassan Township, Hugo, Shorewood, and well, maybe this was the clarification Lisa was waiting for me to make, is that we didn't actually hold the hearing for Carver because of the stipulated agreement, and their issue was around their annexation, orderly annexation area with Dahlgren Township. Okay. So in 2015, there were 27 local governments that contacted the council after the issuance of those decennial system statements. Again, forecasts were one of the primary issues. That's normal. Communities care very much about how much growth is forecasted for their community, and we have those conversations all the time. Several other issues related to affordable housing allocation, community designation, transportation elements of the plan, and less frequently sewer flow, staging and phasing of annexation areas, and then just general process for updating the comp plan in 2015. So we resolved issues for 15 local governments, sector representatives, again, critical in helping to resolve a lot of those issues. give an example there. Some issues required further discussion or review for 11 local governments, again, mostly around forecasts. And we do continuously work with local governments on forecasts, and then we bring any of those proposed changes kind of at a batch after all of the negotiations are done, and we take that to the council for a single action at the end, and then we would reissue system statements after that is officially adopted by the council. There was one request for hearing that did move forward in 2015. That was the city of Oak Grove. They requested that hearing be held at the Office of Administrative Hearings with an administrative law judge. They requested an amendment to the system statement related to a change in their community designation, a change in the description and the availability of sewer service and guiding for that. The administrative law judge ruled in favor of the Met Council as our system had adequately and appropriately represented very long-term plans for the council and investments that we had made to extend service towards the city. However, the city later requested legislative changes to make exceptions for their community, and the legislature did make those changes. So we changed then in turn our system statement in response to the legislative direction. So this year, in issues raised, household and population forecasts, we had mapping updates or corrections really related to MUSA boundaries, some functional road classifications, changes in transit ways. We have had some conversations with communities that are still on the developing edge and planning when they would take on different areas of their community as providing sewer service, and the timing and availability of when the council plans on extending those services as opposed to where and when the community may want those services. We've also had a conversation with communities about some regional park system components and disagreements around long-term plans for some of our system elements. We're tracking those requests, and we posted materials last Friday, and so even still we're taking new questions. I think we're up to 26 communities that have made requests, asked questions of the sector representative, asked for clarifications. A lot of times we're just agreeing to, oh yes, that map should represent this MUSA boundary. We forgot about that one amendment. It wasn't in our system at the time as we were issuing those, developing those maps. Those are fairly easy to resolve. There's a fairly equal geographic distribution as to where questions are coming in and what kind of communities are asking, although primarily suburban edge communities are contacting us the most. We do have kind of 3 different categories of pending, in process, and we have received a formal request in front of us. Pending means that we have, I have them out of order actually. In progress means that we've received something, we're kind of gathering information, evaluating issues. Pending means that we have sent a response and we're waiting to hear back from a community on whether or not that negotiated solution is appropriate or in agreement. We have many now resolved questions or concerns. Over 10 have now been resolved. We have received 1 formal request for hearing that came from the city of Lakeville. We feel very strong about recent meetings with the city. I think it was a misunderstanding about the process of when you should request a hearing, which is just fine, and we will create a stipulated agreement. Their issue was forecast adjustments, and I think that we've come we're getting to a negotiated agreement as to what their revised forecast may or may not be. We do anticipate though that in addition to resolving that request for a hearing, that we do expect other requests for hearings to come in, totaling about 4 or 5. And again, a lot of those are forecast related concerns. We do always plan for the possibility of those hearings coming before this committee. You wouldn't be taken aback by that. We would have plenty of materials and training for you in preparation of any hearing. We would have 60 days to schedule that unless a community agreed for a longer time period. So we would be able to meet in January and cover anything. And again, a community could request that that be held at the Office of Administrative Hearings, where then we would simply follow along the process so that you were well informed of what's happening. But the request for hearing may not actually be held in this body. So that is a very quick version of a very complicated process that happens only once every 10 years. And so we're in the midst of it right now. By the end of November, we expect to have a better count on what those hearings would be and where communities are requesting those hearings to be held. But I'm happy to take any questions and reserve the right to call for a phone a friend if you need to.
Questions? Go ahead, Dan.
Just a couple of things. So do the hearings typically take place at a regular LUAC meeting, not at a special meeting, or do those get scheduled outside of the normal meeting schedule?
Chair and committee members, it could be both. It could be either. We do try and only have LUAC meetings when we're expecting them. However, if we're trying to meet a statutory requirement, we do then, of course, we may have to request a special hearing. But because the statute now allows for us to have a negotiated schedule, we're hoping that we can hold those within the scope of a regular meeting.
And the second question was, so we have the hearing and then the LUAC, if it's before the LUAC then has a subsequent discussion about ultimately what the report would be. Has it been the experience that there's a lot of public interest in making more public comment at the discussion of the report stage after the hearing, or is that, I mean, because I see that sometimes at City Council where we have an official hearing at the Planning Commission about a land use thing, and then there's still a lot of interest in testifying about the recommendation at the City Council. So I was just wondering if that's something that's been experienced in this process.
Chair and committee members, I'm going to take what I think is the right answer, and I'll ask for support if needed. This isn't the same as a public hearing. This is a dispute hearing, and so it's not necessarily the local government has a role, the council has a role, the LUAC has a role, but the public at large, I don't believe, is invited into the conversation.
Okay. Thank you.
Jerry, go ahead.
Did I hear right, after the hearing, the decision made at LUAC is just a recommendation to the council board then?
Correct.
So they can overrule what we decided then?
Ultimately, chair and committee members, ultimately, the council does make the final determination, correct?
Go ahead, Sean.
First off, Angela, I just have to say I'm impressed how you always manage to direct your comments through the chair, because I think it's such an awkward parliamentary thing, but I notice that every time. It's very good. Anyway, no, my question is, Lakeville, the one where there is a request for hearing, does that mean they've already sort of attempted to work things out through staff and try to find something, and they're not satisfied with sort of staff's response to them?
Chair and committee members, what I would say is that the city and the council didn't have a clear understanding of the process at start.
Okay.
And so they kind of preempted the conversations around negotiations and thought they had to request a hearing first.
Okay.
And so now we're well in the negotiated
So
conversations.
it might as well
And I
get
think these are
resolved.
going well, correct.
Also,
I think that the Lakeville one will come to a conclusion.
okay, thank you.
Lana?
When you say forecast, do you just mean the population forecast? There's not other forecasts that are being disputed?
Chair and committee members, it could be population, household, or employment forecasts. We had in 2015 stipulated agreement around employment forecasts for one of the cities that came forward. But most of the forecast conversations this year are around household population rates.
Go ahead, Bill.
Just a quick comment, since my peer Ramsey County is in here. State demographer is showing Dakota County bypassing Ramsey about 2035. And yet we just had a presentation and your numbers show us 40,000 behind them at 2050. So just a discrepancy. You might want to check into their numbers.
Chair and committee members, We have our own forecast model. We do use information from a wide variety of sources, but ours is a land use and economic based model. And so I'm sure that Todd could probably speak quite eloquently about the difference, but I know that our forecast is based on the information that we have.
I've always found yours to be more accurate historically.
I would agree. Thank you. We have a long track record
The
actually
only
of being very
positive comment for today.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
More to come.
All right. Sweet. Well, this meeting is adjourned.
Not really, but all the.
So are you and the Parker not over yet?